Good evening. Welcome to the Zoning Board of Appeals meeting for January 31st, 2019. It's 7:05 p.m. Tonight we'll continue the public hearing for the Preserve at Abbeville and Abbeville Commons. First up will be John Smolak, who will be introducing the team and setting the agenda for his team. John.
Yep. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, other members of the board. For the record, John Smolak, attorney for the applicants. With me this evening are Tom DePlacido, the project proponent, as well as Rick Rodero of United Consultants, our project engineer, Matt Murphy of Boulder Engineering, our project landscape architect, and also Steve Viteri. Sorry, Steve. Of Madden Associates, our project LSP. Just had a few housekeeping items just to mention as an update to our last hearing, and I'll also mention briefly just what we plan to cover briefly before we further deliberate. In addition to, actually, we had submitted to the board an updated set of waivers based on discussions we had at the last hearing. We used Attorney Hill's last waiver list that was up on the board as the base to start from, and so those waivers have, in terms of proposed edits to those waivers, have been submitted to the Board of Appeals, and I'm sure that that'll be discussed at some point in the very near future. In addition, we've received a final comment letter from Fontecchio Architects in connection with some adjustments to some of the architectural renderings, and we have minor comments that we received back from Glenn Fontecchio, and that'll be addressed in part by Matt Merva. We've also provided the board with a letter from Mass Housing dated January 30th, and typically when you have a project that changes in tenure, for example, the Commons, we're proposing to change it from rental to ownership. We ran the proposed changes by Mass Housing, and what you have is a letter from Mass Housing that states basically several things. First, that the changes that were being proposed and that was discussed principally at the last hearing don't require the issuance of any new project eligibility letter for either of the proposals. And that secondly, that in terms of those changes would be examined at the final approval process, which is, as you're aware, the process after all permits are issued. The applicant would go back to the subsidizing agency to confirm that all the requirements of subsidizing agency have been met as a precondition to going forward with the project. And then lastly, the Mass Housing letter also indicates that basically that since both projects are ownership, that they could be merged together as a single project, which could occur either through the Board of Appeals hearing process or could occur after the issuance of decisions or at the final approval letter stage. And the reason why we pose that question is simply because we have two ownership projects, and so why have two separate decisions, or alternatively two separate cost certifications that would need to be done at the end of the project. So, so that provides additional clarification from Mass Housing in terms of those items. And so that said, for this evening, what we're looking to do is first have Steve Viteri just give you a brief update on the status of the PIP process on the environmental side. That will be followed by Rick Rodero, who will walk you through some adjustments to the subdivision plans, and including new cross sections, and also that would be followed by Matt Merva, who will just give you an update in terms of the landscaping design and the photometric plan, and walk you a little bit through the lighting. So with that said, I turn the discussion over to Steve.
Before Steve begins, I just want to remind everybody this meeting is being audio and video recorded for the open meeting laws of the state of Massachusetts. We also have with us tonight Paul McKinley from Wesson and Sampson as well. Steve.
Thank you. We're in the early phases of field investigation for the environmental response actions under the MCP. On January 11th, The team filed responses to public comments on the Phase 2 scope of work, which delineated the scope of field investigations that are planned right now for the site. Also filed a final Phase 2 scope of work that incorporated comments and the items that were included in the response summary. On January 18th, we commenced field activities. That was the Friday before the MLK holiday. We continued the week of Martin Luther King, collecting data in the field. We're beginning to receive some of that analytical data back, but it's too early to draw any conclusions on risk levels or any of the cleanup requirements. So we continue to work through that. We expect in the coming weeks to receive more environmental sampling data. We'll disseminate information through the PIP mailing list, Mass DEP's online file viewer, and through the information repositories at the Franklin and Norfolk libraries. And we will be having a public meeting. Once we've got all the data synthesized, we have a remediation plan formulated, and that meeting will be preceded by a public notice in the newspaper, letters to the PIP mailing list, at least 14 days before the public meeting. That's my quick update.
Any questions from the board for Steve? Thank you, Steve. Rich?
Hi, good evening. Rick Goodrow with United Consultants. Amy, could you please bring up the reserve project first? The preserve site plans, third one down. There you go. So after our last meeting, we've gone back to looking at the development project for the preserve project, and we've developed the preliminary plans up on the whiteboard here today. That project includes 88 single. That project includes 88 single-family house lots and a roadway system that consists of 3 roads. Let me get this thing to work. First road here is Elliott, Man's Loop, goes circular around the site, and Elliott Drive located to the southwest portion of the site. Elliott Drive has been relocated, as was shown at the last hearing, to be aligned with Brett's Farm Road and provide access into the site. We've also updated the plans to include the latest roadway configurations, the lot configurations. We've added the houses, driveways, water, sewer, and stormwater systems, and the existing site features for the site. Sheet 7 of the drawing set, Amy, if you could scroll down to the last sheet, we've provided a typical roadway cross-section in the top right-hand corner. That roadway cross-section depicts the proposed roadways, the roadway design for the 3 roadways previously mentioned, which are Buckley Way, Elliott Drive, and Man's Loop. What we're proposing is a 50-foot wide right-of-way, property line to property line, with a 26-foot asphalt paved surface. The construction materials being the processed gravel, dense grade, bituminous concrete binder, and bituminous concrete finish courses are all per the town's specifications for a roadway, secondary roadway within the town. We've also proposed in this area a 5-foot sidewalk, which could be shown around the site, various locations within the roadway system itself. The proposed water, sewer, and drain utilities are shown, as well as provisions for cable, electric, and telephone. So that basically is the proposed roadway cross-section for the preserve project.
Excuse me,
Yes.
I noticed it also shows gas here.
Yes. If gas is available, we provided for a location for the gas.
It's not your intent, though, to pipe the entire development for gas at the If it is available, we would try to. If not, that's the opposite of the
Okay, we've received some late comments with respect to the roadway pavement width. I anticipate Rich is going to speak to that a little later, but I'll just leave it at that. Again, our proposal was 26 feet. So what I wanted to also identify was that we made some adjustments to some of the houses, some of the types of the houses to address some of the comments. Some of the houses were changed from a longer, shallower depth house to a more box style or a deeper, narrower house. Particularly in this area here, you can see we changed some of the house types to provide some diversity in that area. Some additional adjustments were made to address some of the setbacks that were discussed. So all of the houses within the preserve will have a minimum front setback of 40 feet from the roadway right away, with the majority of the houses being set back at least 50 feet. And the houses are located greater than 10 feet from the side and rear lot lines. Each of the lots includes a dashed line which show the 40 and 10-foot setbacks that are proposed for that. Amy, if you could go up to sheet 1, 1 of 7, I believe it is. Additionally, we've provided some easements around the area of 51 Lawrence Street. We've also increased that rear setback to 25 feet along the perimeter of all of the houses located along Lawrence Street that the project abuts. So that would be a 25-foot setback for structures as opposed to the 10-foot that the applicant had requested, and that is depicted on the plan with the dash setback lines. Amy, could you please go to the Commons project? So the preliminary plan for Abbeville Commons includes 88 units, which are located in 44 buildings, and additionally has 2 roadways. The plan includes the latest roadways, duplex buildings, driveways, sidewalks and walkways, water, sewer, stormwater systems, and existing site features. The proposed roadway cross-section for the 2 roadways is located on sheet 2. Amy, if you could please go to sheet 2. And then zoom in on the cross-section, if you wouldn't mind. So 2 roadways are proposed, one running generally east-west, one north-south, and those roadways are Morse Road and Thayer Path. The roadway cross-section is proposing for a face-of-curb to face-of-curb of 24 feet of pavement width, Cape Cod berm of 1 foot on each side, 3-foot grass strip abutting the sidewalk, and a 5-foot asphalt sidewalk. A minimum distance has been provided for all of the proposed units from the rear of the sidewalk to any proposed unit of 20 feet, and from the rear of the Cape Cod berm to any proposed unit of 20 feet. The site plans depict those setbacks are met, and that was done to allow for vehicles to park in front of the buildings within the driveways, and there not to be any bumper overhang into a sidewalk impeding any pedestrian movements or extending out into the roadway and impeding any of the traffic that's proposed. All of these buildings are located a minimum of 20 feet from the property lines and 20 feet, as I said, from the sidewalk or back of the Cape Cod berm. Those lines are again depicted as a dashed line encapsulating the area where the units are located. These preliminary plans will evolve into a final design, which will include final site grading, utilities, including sewer system for collection, treatment, and discharge, stormwater system for collection, and ultimately a discharge into various drainage areas, drainage basins, excuse me, and a water supply system will also be provided for the entirety of both projects. And that will take place primarily in the roadway system. We are proposing the addition of a bioretention area, which can be shown here, as well. Oops, sorry, I see some heads turning. Bioretention area here where it was previously shown. We also have the 3 infiltration basins, which are preceded by sediment forebays in the same general areas as we had previously. And we anticipate with the reduction of the project to 176 housing units and approximately 8,000 linear feet of roadway, that there'll be a significant reduction in the stormwater runoff for the project, and that the final adjustments to these basins will reflect that. And the applicant is also proposing to provide stormwater recharge for each of the individual units through a gutter collection system into a recharge unit for each, as I say, for each building. So while we have previously shown that the design plans which have been submitted to the board and reviewed by their consultants address the concerns in the stormwater system and sewer system, site grading, utility designs were adequate, we feel that moving forward with a final design that has the conditions imposed in a comprehensive permit, as well as the waivers that have been requested, can be accomplished and submitted to the board. And we anticipate that would go through a peer review process and ultimately be the plan of record. Amy, if you wouldn't mind going to the Lawrence Street sidewalk plan. At the previous hearing, it was requested that we look at a sidewalk system on the Lawrence Street frontage of the property, as well as along the abutting properties located here, 51, 49, and 45 Lawrence Street, I believe, which are located here. The representatives of the town's Department of Public Works, the applicant, myself, and one of the zoning board members had an opportunity to walk the entirety of Lawrence Street from the proposed roadway here to the Brett's Farm Road intersection. And what we were looking for was a way to be able to construct a sidewalk and identify what particular areas may be of concern. So what this plan depicts is the connection of the sidewalk from the end of the roadway work being completed at the causeway area to the sidewalk system. Additional sidewalk will be constructed along the roadway to this point here, sidewalk to this point here, and then two options were reviewed in that area. Because of the location of the pavement within the right-of-way, being very close to the northerly side of the right-of-way, in this area here, we've identified the sidewalk as option A, that to be constructed at a width of 5 feet and adjacent to the roadway travelway, it would be required to obtain easements from those property owners for the location of the sidewalk, as well as any necessary grading that would be required to construct the sidewalk. Excavation to remove top and subsoil, installation of gravel, things of that nature, and any grading to allow for that to take place. What we discussed in the field was a second option, which would again bring the sidewalk up to this location and then have a cross area here and locate what we've referred to as option B on the south side of the paved surface of the roadway, where there's a greater setback to the roadway right-of-way, which you can see is the dashed line here, and more difficult to see on the north side, but you can see it here. Amy, if you could go to sheet 2, please. That roadway will then continue from the area where we identified the two options converging and travel all the way to and connect with Buckley Way's sidewalk system. Additionally, we've highlighted in blue all of the proposed water main improvements, including hydrants. That would be included as part of this project. That would be a connection from the end of the road Mass Works project at the causeway area up to, the cap located here, a hydrant located here, and then connection into the Buckley Way water system. Amy, if you could go to the 43, 44, and 45 plan. And lastly, we looked at some site grading in the area of 51 Lawrence Street, and we looked at some house locations. We've, as I said, positioned these houses with a minimum 40-foot setback to get them as close to the roadway as possible. We've revised some of the housing units in that area to assist with the grading, and we have identified in 44, 45, and 46 house locations with top of foundation proposed elevations. We've identified some road grading to take place, and what we've basically done is slightly elevated that roadway to allow for reduction in the cut of that area. We've proposed to include a garage under into this unit here with a sloping front yard out to the street, and then a 2-to-1 grade in this general area here, transitioning into a 3-to-1 grade here, and a 3-to-1 grade here, minimal grading here. So from this northwest corner of lot 51 down into the hole that's located on lot 43, we're actually proposing some fill here, so we'll reduce the height of that hill that exists. And that hill we're planning to keep intact with no grading removal, as the slope there currently is approximately 2-to-1, which again is what we're proposing in this area here. And when we look at the house proposed on lot 45, we have a proposed foundation elevation of 237. And we anticipate that the foundation elevation of the 51 Lawrence Street house is approximately 250, which is that contour interval located just to the north of the house. There's actually a drop in the driveway, but we anticipate, as I say, that elevation to be around 250. So this proposed house is approximately 13 feet lower than this house. And there's a 6 to 8 foot elevation rise that's occurring at the rear property line in this area here. So we have that slope occurring in that area to address that. We've also, as I said, sorry, this isn't working. Well, we've provided a 25-foot setback here, and that 25-foot setback, as I said earlier, follows all of the properties that are being abutted by the development that exists on Lawrence Street. And that 25-foot setback is what is required for a rear setback in the R3 zoning district where this property is located. And that grading is outside of that 25-foot area. Thus, we can leave a 25-foot undisturbed buffer in this area, which gets graded as we go both east and west from the proposed grading area. Thank you.
Board. Could you elaborate one more time? Obviously, we'd love to see a contiguous sidewalk coming all the way down, and proposed B was to push a segment of that to the other side of the road and then bring it back so that it was contiguous with the development. What was the reason for that option B? Would you elaborate on that a little bit more?
The reason for the option B would be if the roadway wasn't able to be moved or easements were not able to be obtained from 51, 49, and 45 Lawrence Street, it wouldn't allow for this section from here to here to be constructed. So the idea was that we could come down to this location here and then come across where we would have the ability to construct a sidewalk within the right-of-way, and no easements would be necessary. So, and that was discussed with the DPW as an option.
So option A would require 3 easements, is that correct?
Correct.
Rick, can you describe what kind of work you're doing on Lawrence Street in that location? You're widening the street, right? And you're going to be doing some work in the street. So would it be possible to basically shift the paved surface of the street south to incorporate that sidewalk on the north side?
It would be possible to do that in some locations, but for instance, in this location here, there's a utility pole, some other utility poles that are located to the north, so it would require a significant shifting of that road to accomplish moving of the road and then creating a sidewalk in front of the utility poles. That is an option.
We have with poles. Is that what you're saying?
We would move the poles.
No.
We would really prefer not to have the poles moved.
Wait, so I got a question. Are those poles on the properties already?
No, the poles are actually within the 3 to 5 feet that the roadway.
Right. So you don't think you can take that upline and get behind the poles on there?
Correct. So there's one area where we've identified a little bump out. And again, this is very preliminary. There's been no final grading, no look at any trees that would want to be saved as part of this. This is, again, just something preliminary to show where the applicant is at with respect to providing a sidewalk along Lawrence Street. I think, I don't want to speak for Tom, but I believe that Tom is looking at different options to have the sidewalk constructed, and one option would be that the town would actually construct it, and Tom would fund it. Correct me if I'm wrong. So this is,
Have you run these by Bob McGee or anybody?
yes, Bob McGee has these.
What does he think about option A and option B?
I haven't heard any comments back from him, but it was discussed in the field as some options, so we took the liberty to basically put a plan together.
They would prefer option A, because we don't want people having to cross the street. So option A is the preferred method.
Without question.
It all depends, obviously, we need the easements, but option A was the preferred method. He's going back again tomorrow with the selectmen to show them the two different options as well, so.
Thank you.
Couple questions. You didn't get away unscathed. I apologize if these are coming a little late, but the cross-section for the road, the sewer appears to be sitting right in the middle of the road.
Yes.
And if you have a crown and you have a manhole right in the center of the road, then your rim of that manhole, you have your crown.
Yeah.
That rim would be sitting above the road elevation. And if a plow's coming through, that might be kind of
Yeah, they typically feather the pavement. You're talking about a 2% cross-section. You're talking a quarter of an inch from center of the manhole to the edge.
I actually heard that in another town. It was a DPW director who was telling me that I think what happened is the plow was driving and they hit the side of that rim structure.
Mhm.
It sounded like it was a really, really dangerous situation. No one got killed or anything, but to me that seems really concerning if that's in the center of the road.
Yeah, we can look at it, but typically they blend the pavement to the structures. They're not going to leave a quarter-inch lip sticking up when they pave it.
That's a standard cross-section. That's probably Mass DOT spec and to have sewer going right down the middle of the road. But actually, any manhole, catch basin, granite curb, and anything like that is something that a plow could catch too. And actually has to, DPW, should watch those types of things and stuff too. Just actually, it settles or anything around that. You could have that with a drain manhole, with a catch basin, anything like that. So even like expansion joints and bridges and stuff, it's a danger for plows, wherever it is. But in general, any sewer we've put in, Village of River's Edge or the places in Franklin, things we've done, it's always down the center line, so you get the proper setback distances from sewer to water, drain, and everything like that. So it is a concern, Devin, but it's a concern actually with all the utilities too.
My second question was actually going to be on the proximity of water and sewer. I thought the minimum distance between the two had to be 10 feet.
Most distances are taken from the town's typical cross-section. And we typically would prefer 10 feet from the water to the sewer, and then 7 feet to the drain.
7 feet. What did you say?
Some drain to sewer. As I said, those mimic what's in the town of Norfolk typical cross-section.
The town is the reloading. I said maybe the town is the
And,
reloading cross-section.
and we can certainly talk with Bob McGee.
Yeah.
If he has some preference and the board was amenable to going along with his recommendations as it evolves into final utility design, we can certainly take those things into consideration.
Okay. And just my third question was on, and I saw this with one of the conditions, with the possibility of people on Lawrence Street being able to tie into water. And I just noticed that there was no gate valve after the water that goes into the development. So if someone wanted to tie into the water main, the only way to shut off the run that goes down Lawrence Street past the first entrance, wouldn't that have to be shut off before the development, so the whole development would be shut down?
Following.
So at the first entrance, there's one gate valve.
Yeah, we put three in. There's one shown, we'll look at that, but we put it three-way gate valve system.
You only showed one, but
Okay.
I just,
Yeah, three would be standard. Absolutely. So you could isolate each one of the three segments.
yeah,
no,
I
that's
just saw it on the plan, I just wanted to make sure that it was brought up.
Okay, no, thank you for that. We'll certainly look at that. That's the intent, is three gate valves.
Okay.
Bob, will you make sure?
Bill, any comments?
No, I would just, Devin's comment regarding the 10-foot offset between water and sewer, I would agree with. The only thing I would suggest is you want to also look at the depth, because if the water is higher than the sewer, then that setback can be a little bit smaller. And I would also echo the manholes on the center line, but I would suggest that since the manholes generally occur at bends in the line, that there's an opportunity to move that manhole off the center line, so it's not falling right there. So those are the only two things I would add.
Go ahead, Rich.
Richard McCarthy, Norfolk Town Planner. I did want to, the large, what's the loop road? Well, actually, it doesn't matter. All the so I did talk to Bob McGee and Barry, DPW Director, Assistant DPW Director, about going to 24 feet versus the 26 feet. And they were agreeable to do that, to bring the road down a little bit narrower, to keep, again, since I like to try to keep the roads a little bit narrower these days than wider, to keep speeds down and so forth. So I know the plan, we didn't connect to have maybe a change to that cross section, but the recommendation is to go with 24 feet, not 26 feet on the road.
No, that wouldn't be a problem.
And that's a recommendation from the DPW.
Is that just on the inner loop or the outer loop?
The whole entire road. The townhouses are 24 now.
Correct.
So the whole road is just going to be 24.
So the main loop road that encapsulates the inner circle, if you will, and then the two entrance roads are proposed right now to be 26. And it seems like there's preference to make those three roadways 24 feet. And that would then have the entire roadway system, the condominium roads and the housing development all be 24 feet.
Last point. To Devin's point, I know the subdivision regs have the wider, but we do need to update the regs, so we would, yeah.
Thank you, Rich. You can go.
Thank you.
I think you're gonna have Matt speak now. Matt, you got 4 minutes.
I'll be so quick.
Gonna cut you short tonight. He wants to do.
Amy, do you mind pulling up the other presentation? Matt Merva with Bowler Engineering, landscape architect for the project. Just a couple of quick things we wanted to touch on tonight. We've developed some of the entry signage for the project that is going to be incorporated onto stone walls. So the first exhibit you're looking at there depicts the entry at Buckley Way, with stone walls flanking either side of the entrance, with the name of the development and two piers at either end of that stone wall. The inlay would be a granite sign with the letters carved in, and then the lighting would just be uplighting from the ground, which is shown in that cross section that would shine up on just onto those letters essentially, but with a lantern on top of each pier denoting that entrance. So there would be one of these on either side of Buckley Way so that you could see it as you're heading eastbound and westbound. And then interior to the site, just to orient you. So the one I just pointed out, if you look back at the screen, is right here at Buckley Way. And then we have an entry sign into the condominium core at these two locations. So that is what this enlargement is depicting. So again, a low stone wall with piers at either end. In this case, these aren't town roads. We're introducing some special paving at that main entrance to mark going into that condominium community from the main loop road. And again, the entry sign on either side of that entry, and that occurs in those two locations that I just mentioned. So those walls have granite caps, and they would be stone-faced walls. And again, that's a granite inlay of the sign with uplighting for those letters.
What kind of stone?
The stone we'd end up selecting, it'd be sort of a natural looking, it's not like a Versalock or a Unilock type of, it's a natural stone. Field stone, correct, yep. And then we've also updated the lighting plans to correspond to the new layout. So the next sheet you'll see is the overall plan, and the symbols are a little difficult to see, so we've just blown them up on the screen here and on your next page. The orange symbols are the street light fixture. We're using those mainly at the key intersections. We have 13 of those lights throughout the site. Those are 14-foot pole mounting height, and that's a direct down light. Again, we haven't changed the fixtures that we've been showing, but just changed the layout, obviously, to go with the new site plan. And then at each unit or house, then there's the shorter pole that we showed you a photo of at the last hearing, and those go throughout the neighborhood, one at each unit. So we've updated photometric plans, and you can see that the darker outline, this is really the only place where we have 1-foot candle, and then if you zoom in, you can see the lumens, the foot candles out beyond those areas start to decrease, obviously. So it's lighting more for wayfinding. We're not trying to light this up like a shopping center. It's very low-level lighting, and really just bringing the intersections and key wayfinding areas up a little bit. So we've provided coverage for the entire project through there. Relative to sidewalks, I know Rick has touched on that already, but we've updated the plans to include the sidewalks along the outer edge of the loop road, and we also have sidewalks down one side of the condominium roads as well, in addition to some pathways, some trails connecting some of the open space within the development. So not too much different from what you've seen on the last time, but a little bit further refinement of that and how that's laid out in the interior of the site. And I think Rick's plans blow that up pretty well for you to be able to see. I think Rick has already touched on some of the variation of the house types that we looked at this go-around. So I'm not going to get back into that, but glad to answer any questions you have on these updates so far. As Rick mentioned, with kind of fine-tuning the civil plans, we also intend to do the same with the overall landscape plans as we move forward, and hope that that can be a condition of the approval as well, where we refine those landscape plans back to where they had kind of started, but based on the new layout here and incorporating the peer review comments that we had received and responded to previously.
Bill, any comments with regard to lighting?
No, I think this is pretty much the same approach that we had talked about with the other plans, lighting the intersections with street lighting for safety, and relying on the driveway lights to kind of level, excuse me, light for the sidewalks through the development. So I think it's consistent with what we've reviewed before.
Great. Matt, are the poles going to be for the house lights, are they going to be an AZAC or a granite post, do you know yet?
I think those are a wood product of some kind, right, Tom? The post lights at the houses, they're not, it's not a metal pole, it's a...
An AZAC or
yeah.
Plastic wood?
Exactly.
Any other questions from the board for Matt?
Okay. Did I keep it to 4? Was I close to 4 minutes?
You were.
All right.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. Good job. At this time, we're going to, at the next meeting, we're going to continue with the revisions to the waivers. As you all recall, last meeting, we worked on the waivers. We're still working on just some fine tuning of the waivers. We will do that at the next meeting. So tonight, we're going to start to go over the comprehensive permit and the conditions. What we're going to do is we are going to start with conditions that have some effects with the E21 process, so that we have Paul McKinley here, and I know some of the residents have got to go out of town, so they asked us if we push that up, as well as to help Steve Ruggieri as well, so we can address those right up front. What we'll do is Dan is going to review each paragraph or each bullet point. We're going to allow comments from our peer reviewers. Also, we've got some comments from Rich McCarthy, our town planner, Sean Reardon, who is one of our peer consultants. So you may see them coming up and addressing a point with regard to the conditions. And then at the end of every section of conditions, so section H, which will deal with the E21 comments, we'll allow for a few minutes for the public, so that we're not forcing you at the very end to try to remember each one of the conditions. So we'll allow for a few minutes to discuss the conditions or any concerns you have. So that's going to be the process we're going to use. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to start with the, I think you're going to start with the conditions, correct? Go right to the conditions, or you're going to start with the, okay. You're not going to go to the finding of facts, correct? Okay.
All right, so I think we'll start with section C. Section C is construction conditions. There's some discussion in there about dust and noise and other technical details that our consulting engineers and LSPs can help with. And then after section C, we'll jump to section H, which deals with the mass contingency plan and historic site contamination. As the chair mentioned, we've got comments from Bill, from Sean, from Rich, probably missing somebody, but you know, when we get to a paragraph that you guys have commented on, it'd be helpful if you just jump in and make that comment unless Chris does. And we don't need to dwell on each one. So if there's no comments on a section, we'll just keep going. But if a board member wants to talk about any of these specific sections as we go through it, just stop me. So do you all have a copy of the? And what I put on the screen is actually Sean's markup, just for ease of reference. But all right, so the first condition on section C is Actually, before we get to, I guess one concept, I've defined the term construction activities as meaning basically any site activities, any site clearing. And you'll see a consistent theme in this decision that before construction activities can commence, the developer has to do certain things. So that's intentional that I set that as, basically the threshold is you can't do any work on the site at all until certain things have happened. If that can be tweaked, of course, the board could say before a building permit is issued, that would give the developer a lot more flexibility to start doing site clearing work. But in all the towns that I work with, most of the decisions that we've drafted, most boards want to have all the ducks in a row before any site clearing happens. So that's what construction activity means. So section C1, prior to the commencement of construction activities, there has to be a pre-construction meeting. This is just simply to get all the players together so that there's expectations in terms of the phasing of the project and work starting times and things like that. So this is basically just a boilerplate condition. Any comments? Okay, hearing none. Section C2. The applicant shall accommodate inspections during the construction of the project to ensure compliance with the terms of the decision. So what will happen, this is a common condition for most projects, for every project, the board is going to want, just like the planning board would have inspections of subdivision infrastructure work, this board is going to want to have an engineer and potentially other consultants inspecting various stages of the development of the project. Most specifically, the construction of the road, the utilities that get put in, the stormwater facilities, and also, lot development as well. I mean, there's a lot of grading on the site, and so as lots get graded out, you want to make sure that stormwater prevention techniques are used so that you don't have erosion and scouring on lots that affect other lots. So there's a lot of inspection and monitoring that happens during the course of the project. So the concept with section C2 is that the applicant is agreeing to this. The applicant has to fund it. And there's a condition in here somewhere that the applicant has to deposit a $20,000 deposit at the start of the project. That goes into a fund that the treasurer maintains. It's the same fund that's been being used to pay these consultants during this hearing.
Looking on the screen, what we see on the screen, is that showing the edit? That's going to be for this? Or?
Yeah, that's Sean's recommended edit, and that's just all the red lines are Sean's red lines.
So the interval of inspections, so is that kind of, I see the word periodic strike. Striking, is that?
Yeah.
So in terms of inspections, just inspections, normal interval of inspections?
I don't think it's not typical for us to get into that level of detail in the decision. So that's something that prior to the commencement of construction, there'll be this team meeting, and the consulting engineer will advise the board how often these inspections shall occur, and probably come up with a schedule of how that would work. But I don't think that's something we'd want to micromanage in a decision.
And the building inspector has asked, the building commissioner of Norfolk had asked in the second to last line, where it says the building inspector shall coordinate inspection, he would like that to say that the contractor shall coordinate inspections and construction. So it would be into the last line. The building inspector, he would like that to read that the contractor shall coordinate. And he's also asked that all units will be clearly marked with signage at the address, of the address at the street frontage as soon as permits are pulled.
I'm just making notes here. And we don't need to nail down the language specifically, but right. Just,
I can also do
see this. All right, section C3. So there's going to be a construction management plan, which there'll be other conditions. Actually, in the B section, there's a condition that deals with the construction management plan. The applicant shall conduct all construction activity in accordance with the CMP, and so that just imposes that requirement. Again, boilerplate. Do we have anything on that? Section.
Sorry, the only thing I would suggest in that paragraph is specifically mentioning sediment and erosion controls.
Oh, okay. Section C4, the applicant shall provide permanent central mailbox units. Actually, that's a question for the applicant. I'm not sure how you plan on dealing with mailboxes. Maybe there isn't a central facility for that.
Actually, they're on the plans, they're located around the site.
So there will be centralized?
Yeah, central mailbox units.
Okay. All right, section C4. Yeah, right, so I'll renumber this when we get to it. I mean, John, do you want to explain the reasoning for this condition?
Well, as you know, the whole purpose of 40B is to streamline the process, combine local permits into a single permitting process. And so we feel that that in terms of the local wetlands bylaw, since we don't have any wetlands jurisdiction, you know, in the event that at some point in the future, either with the request for an NRAD, issuance of an ORAD or an RFD, that should be, in terms of establishing the wetlands lines in the future, that should be governed by the state act instead of the local bylaw to simplify matters. Also, in terms of Wetlands Protection Act jurisdiction, the other piece is that consistent with other prior decisions, this board has waived on many occasions the applicability of the local wetlands bylaw. And so we're requesting that waiver as well, particularly in the event that in the future, if there is any required remediation or any repair of any dam, we think that there are adequate protections under the state wetlands regulations to deal with those particular issues.
Rich, do you want to comment on that or no?
This actually is more of a condition here as opposed to the waiver from the local bylaw. But one of the things to discuss with Janet DeLong today, the conservation agent, is if the applicant perhaps maybe could be specify more what you're looking waive in relation to the local wetland bylaw as opposed to just a blanket waiver. And then maybe we could tie it back to this. This is not necessarily perhaps opposed, but rather than have a blanket approach to it, it'd be better to have a better idea of what specifics are. So that's what we would request.
One thing I could mention in that regard too is I know the local bylaw has a 50-foot restriction as well. I mean, which could actually be imposed under the state act. You know, just instead of having two separate local bylaw and the state act working at different angles, just impose that condition under the local, from the local bylaw into any potential order of conditions in the future, and then leave it up to the Conservation Commission to determine whether we meet other interests protected under the act. So again, consolidating it through the state review process under the state regs, but also employing some of the local bylaw standards.
So you're suggesting a 50-foot buffer? Is that what you said?
Well, Yes, and the only exception might be in case there's any potential dam work that needs to be done or any remediation work that might need to be done in the future. I mean, those would be covered by an emergency potential, or actually a limited project provision under the local wetlands, under the state wetlands regulations.
And actually, I think you John, had proposed that there would be a blanket waiver of the wetland bylaw for all work. And I actually changed his language to make it that the waiver from the bylaw was only for work related to remediation activities of the MCP. So just so you all know, I mean, what he had asked for is actually broader than what I had drafted. But it still kind of falls in the category of a blanket waiver in that we don't know what you need. And we're just, we would be granting a waiver for something that might happen in the future, which is not something we generally recommend as a matter of course.
Okay.
So we can table this if you want and think about it and go back to it. All right.
Back to the waiver.
All right, C5, as-built plans, just boilerplate again, that once the infrastructure is built, you'd provide an as-built. Same thing with section C6, as-built utility plan, be provided to the Department of Public Works. Section C7, standard condition that the applicant shall ensure that there's no nuisance conditions existing on the site. This language is useful for situations that might come up during the construction of the project. You know, if we need some language that has some teeth to hold the developer accountable, there's obviously enough language here that we can do that. So.
You just mentioned one thing in terms of C7. There's a provision in there concerning fencing. And so it's a very broad provision in terms of fencing. We have a 200-acre site. I assume the board is looking for us to fence a 200-acre site. So we need to have some limitation on that in terms of, and maybe that's something we can discuss and table that particular issue to try to narrow that a little bit.
Well, the original language actually said a big wall, and I brought it down to
Yeah, I know, well, that's what I figured, but I would expect nothing less from you, Dan, thank you. So, but just as a general matter as well, we very much like our consulting engineers, all three of them, typically in a 40B situation or a circumstance, basically, we look to impose requirements that would otherwise be consistent with requirements that would be imposed under the subdivision process if this was not a 40B. So my concern here is there are a lot of open-ended inspection requirements, and later conditions require the review of three different peer review consulting engineers. We think that's really excessive. So, and we could talk about that a little bit later, but I just, as a general comment, we think this should be treated no differently from a project that would be approved under 40A and the subdivision control law.
I was going to ask one thing on C5 is if we could add something, language.
You have to get a mic, I think.
If we could just add language to C5 that any elevations have to be to a known datum, was it North American datum of 1983?
88, I believe vertical is 88.
88. Horizontal is 83. If the any elevations for as-built plans shall be to vertical datum of 1988.
NAVD 88, North American vertical datum 88.
Okay. We'll go back to that. All right. Also, if you're on, since we're back to C5, also added the building department
also to receive the as-bills as well as the CBA, second line.
Okay, and then in terms of the fencing, I guess my response to that would be, that strikes me as something that would be probably covered in a construction management plan, and so I think that detail could be worked out at that point. Section C8 hours, I'm not sure, yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, I realize that. Could you make that bigger?
Yeah.
So now I realize I put a lot of comments in the wrong spot related to this condition, but a few of the things I would like to have consideration added to it is one about relative to startup. So 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. mean 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. I don't want to see preparation before those times, equipment or so forth and so on. I'm sure that some of the neighbors have endured some of the things related to the Lawrence Street project that we're learning. A condition relative to that. I think we should also probably have some provisions in there relative to delivery of equipment, supplies, et cetera, that they happen within those hours. And that if delivery, like in the same regard, they're not out on Lawrence Street waiting to deliver materials, which we've learned, unfortunately, the hard way on a project already, so we don't want to repeat that. And again, emphasize no idling or parking on Lawrence Street at all. I think you covered that in another section, Dan, but I just want to make sure that that's in there. And then on the same, on C8, I was wondering about the timing. So you have 30 months in there? That seems pretty aggressive for this project.
I think that's an error, correct?
Okay.
That's a transcription error.
Yeah. We wish it was 30 months.
I mean, you want to put a drop dead 7 years or whatever? Does that matter? Let me think about it.
Let's table that, and we can talk about it. Any comments?
So those hours mirror the general bylaw, hours of operation, construction operation.
They do, yeah.
Yes.
35, 36 of section 10 of the general bylaws.
Yeah, those are the same.
Then we should just refer to those compliance with the bylaws, I would think.
Which is having some comments that we can.
Well, I had a little more clarity on,
Yeah, what start means.
yeah,
All right.
just so it's clear.
Staging consent.
All right. Section C9, now this deals with air pollution monitoring mitigation. I know this topic was addressed with the Board of Health last month. There was a comment letter provided by Weston and Sampson to the Board of Health that we were copied on that provided some a framework for conditions that could be imposed on a permit relating to dust mitigation and noise mitigation. So this is the language I just came up with. I took the Weston and Sampson letter and turned it into a condition, essentially. So the point here is not to set up monitoring stations that are continuously collecting data every hour, every day, because I think something like that could be probably very costly and potentially uneconomic for a project. So the point of this was to set up a plan with monitoring stations and standards that cannot be exceeded, and that there would be periodic monitoring inspection that would be determined by our consulting engineer.
Just one question. How many of the projects projects in the town of Norfolk have dust mitigation, noise mitigation, vibration standards have been imposed on them in terms of other projects.
I mean, have we ever had a 160-acre site
Yeah,
blasted out with?
true, but this is all covered by the construction management plan as well. Again, really excessive, I believe.
Sean? And, Sean and then,
Yeah.
and then Paul.
And just keep in mind, this is largely a function of the earth removal activities, so you know, that's part of the overwhelming condition that they are removing over 500,000 yards, so I don't know if you have a similar situation like that anywhere else in town.
Paul?
Was the memorandum that we had prepared circulated, or was it not?
I think it actually, since it hasn't been discussed at a public Board of Health meeting, I don't think it has been distributed, correct?
Yeah, they have, Board of Health hasn't had a chance to look at it, but I mean, you could. Yeah, just to talk about it. Yeah, talk about a few critical elements. I mean, due to the contaminants and the proximity to receptors, you know, it proposed or recommended that a dust mitigation plan be prepared that could be monitoring periodically, but a lot of projects, sometimes it's full real time during the duration of the project, or during all excavation and management of contaminated soils. Some elements of the plan would include public involvement, how that data is evaluated and disseminated. In this condition, I know it mentions 150 micrograms per meters cubed. That's a maximum threshold, and so a site-specific threshold was recommended, which is typically lower than 150, just to be protective of nearby receptors. So a site-specific, both a background level and a site-specific action level is recommended to be developed in that plan. So those are some you know, key elements of that condition.
Thank you.
Then why don't we suggest that not have the mitigation plan cover the entire project? If there's a concern about dust with respect to any OHM, then deal with it in those particular areas, not the entire project. If that's the issue.
One of the elements of the plan would be some monitoring stations. I think we recommended 5. And the locations of those, this could be something that could be addressed in the public involvement process and other sites to address concerns of the residents, see where those stations could be located, sometimes in between the area of excavations and receptors. But it would be recommended that in the public process, the number of stations and where they're located might be the way to tackle that.
Paul, I think it'd be better if we could nail that down as part of the decision, and we're gonna have another hearing, and we have time to figure this out. It's better practice to minimize the open issues beyond a decision. So I'd like to advise and recommend that we try to come up with a plan, or at least some ideas of where we'd want those monitoring stations to be, what that standard should be if it's not 150. And you know, if there's a lower threshold, then I'd like to know what the justification would be for that lower threshold. But I think the more details we can work out as part of the decision, the better, because that, in fairness to applicants, you know, if we leave that open-ended, then it could be, you know, it could get too excessive, and then we potentially have a fight.
Sure, I'm sort of looking at Steve, and I think the recommendation is for the applicant to develop a dust mitigation plan. We had some recommended elements in there that we recommended to have into the plan, so sort of look at him and how that's established and developed, and we'll certainly be happy to review it.
Is that something that you guys could do before we close the hearing and work on conditions? This is a question for...
I just think it's important to make a distinction between excavation and earthwork within the disposal site boundaries, where there's contaminated soil versus earthwork outside the disposal site boundary. And so public involvement plan is specifically geared towards MCP issues, environmental contamination, oil and hazardous materials, and the bulk of this earthwork actually occurs outside that process. So just wanted to make that point.
Okay, so I guess a question back to Tom and his team, is that, are you willing to work on a dust plan before we issue the permit?
We can look into it, yes.
Because I think we'd all benefit from more detail in the decision, rather than pushing that can down the road and doing it later. But, yeah. All right.
And Paul, can you set some minimum, and maybe working with Steve, some minimum requirements, in other words, on the standard, how many dust monitors, what would be the minimum standard that could be presented to the developer, so that it's not just we have some definitive points that we want to make. In other words, what's the standard going to be? If it's not going to be 150, are we going to say the minimum's going to be 120? Is it going to be 3 monitoring stations on Lawrence Street? And, again, and also go into the depth as to when are we going to do it? Is it going to be real time all the time? Or is it during excavation? Is it during digging of foundations? Can we set some minimum standards for our next meeting to pinpoint this?
Absolutely. Well, we made recommendations on the thresholds and the number of stations and the frequency of monitoring. And that, again, that's something that we could discuss with the applicant and see if we're of like mind on the degree of monitoring that might be prudent for the project. So but we certainly have recommendations and thoughts on similar projects and experience, how we would go about addressing dust and both due to dust with potential contaminants in it, and also dust as part of the project is also a potential health risk. So just to address that comment, dust monitoring may be applicable in various phases to both aspects of the project.
And if you can identify those two for the next meeting, what areas would not be required, what areas would be?
Sure.
Okay.
And then similarly with noise, Weston and Sampson had some recommended conditions or language for noise mitigation and monitoring. I suggested that we'd have noise monitoring stations at 51 Lawrence Street, which is, I think, probably the most directly affected abutter, and then the 2 project driveway entrances, so we have it spread out along Lawrence Street. But again, we can talk about that if there's other areas or fewer areas that made more sense. We could talk about that. In terms of monitoring and collection of data, I don't think it's practical to have a monitoring station collecting data continuously unless you tell me that it is practical. But usually what happens is that you'd send somebody out there randomly when there's a lot of noise and collect data and collect the noise readings.
I think you'd say the same about vibration, correct?
Yep. Yeah, so C10, very similar. We'd have a requirement that the applicant implement measures to mitigate vibrations. There'll be seismic monitoring stations to collect data on a random basis.
I just have a clarification on C10. What is the standard that you would use for vibrations? That's a new one on me. You have seismic recorder, but what is the standard that you're using to measure vibration? I've never seen that on a site, on a project, but maybe someone can elaborate.
Yeah, there are specifications DOT has, so there are very real-time vibration meters that can be installed. And I will mention that vibration, oftentimes the concern is structural damage. So another alternative, if we don't want to do monitoring, is you could actually do a pre and post inspection of close structures. That certainly is an option as well, if the periodic monitoring is not feasible. So, but certainly the vibration monitors can be installed similarly to the dust monitoring. The data can be collected, periodically downloaded, evaluated to see if there are peaks that could potentially damage structure.
You have a, come on, yeah, sure. Steve?
A lot of the literature and studies on vibration monitoring and effects on structures deal with historic buildings and distances that are really tight, like 25, 50 feet. So if you run some calculations, there are models out there that I think we should look at. If you're operating excavation equipment, the type of equipment that would be operated here at the site, in most cases, you would need to be a couple hundred feet is adequate distance so that there's no perceptible impact. So I think that's something that should be looked at before we, before we commit to something.
I think we'd like Wes and Sampson, you to get together and try to hash this out and come back to us both with recommendations and the reasons why. Okay? Are we in agreement? Yep. Hmm?
So the question was, if there's going to be any blasting, and none is anticipated. I remember Tom saying that in the past, but we do have a blasting condition in here that's separate, so that if there is blasting unexpectedly, then they have to comply with certain conditions.
That's what I'm more familiar with. If it's blasting, it's meant to create.
Yes.
We talking about blasting?
No.
No. Not yet.
Okay, so C11 is traffic, simply stating that the applicant shall implement traffic controls around the site. C12.
For C12, just would like to add language that the roadways would not be accepted until the top course has gone through a complete winter before we would have them petition to be accepted as public ways.
Is that in subdivision?
It's I believe it is, but it's not. It's a standard condition we've imposed on subdivisions.
Is there a chance that we can accept this for quite some
Joe, you have to go to a mic.
Rich, is there a chance we might not accept these roads inside the development for quite some time because it's going to be going on for a few years? Yeah. So, right, so at the time you say it gets through a full winter, it would have to be at the point where we say, you might have to set a start and a stop on that statement.
Well, I'm presuming they'll probably construct the roads and do them typically like it would. It'd be run on the binder until, we get towards the end when the final homes are nearing completion, the heavy construction work, and then it would be done. So there'll be,
From the time the top coat goes down.
this just the top coat, yeah.
Okay. C13, can't bury stuff on site. C14, the gravel for the roadways be tested at the expense of the applicant. Standard condition. C15, utilities underground. That's your intent, right? C16, stabilization. We talked about maybe adding a bond requirement for that, so I'll work on that language. This section essentially requires that disturbed areas not be left open and unstabilized. That's a general requirement of a permit that the applicant must obtain from the federal government called the NIPDES permit and the Stormwater Pollution Prevention. And so I'm going to work on some language to add a bonding requirement so that if the site is left in an unstabilized condition, let's say the applicant goes belly up, goes bankrupt, and the site's just left open, there would be money there for the town to go in and stabilize it. C17, construction vehicles shall be parked on the site and off of public streets. C18, blasting. Did you have a comment?
I don't know why we can't just halt this language to the first paragraph, because B and I believe, B is in excess of state law, and blasting limits can be lowered by the fire department. I'm not aware of that happening, but again, we're following the state blasting regulations and also the recommendations of the fire chief. So I mean, I don't think we need a page for that. I think we could live with the first paragraph. And I don't know why the applicant would have to pay for a blasting consultant, independent blasting consultant. That's not a reasonable expense.
Tom, what was your last point about paying, what was the last statement you made?
Well, just about an independent blasting consultant. I mean, we've already indicated that we're not blasting, and so I don't know why we're going into such extensive detail and in excess of the state regulations on that.
Okay.
So the sections you had a problem with is section B and E?
Right, but all the other provisions are covered by state regulation anyway. So I just don't know why.
Does state regulation include, for example, insurance coverage
Yeah, yeah,
of those limits?
yeah. Well, I don't know if those exact limits, but
I'll meet with the chief.
it's held by regulation.
I'll meet with the chief and just verify it.
We'll look at that.
Yeah.
And we have developments that we've had blasting as part of the conditions or whatever. Look at, we've done other developments in town.
Yeah.
Blasting associated.
We tend not to have we have a ballasting company come in, they pull a permit with the fire department, and they meet the state regs. As you recall, we just blasted right next to the police station. And, basically it's done through, it's basically a blasting plan set up by the contractor that's approved by the Norfolk Fire Department.
We can emulate something we've done before.
Sure.
We'll go through it with the fire chief and check on that.
C19 was more of a placeholder for myself, that if we're gonna have a limit of work condition, that limit of work be flagged on the site before any development activities. I'm not sure if we need that, or if we've talked about it. Is that something, Bill, you think we need to require? I mean, it's more common with, I think, more tight developments where you've got abutters really close.
Typically, what we would see is clearing, so we would know whether there were clear to, and then we run that kind of defines the limit of work anyways. So I think flagging a limit of clearing makes sense.
All right, section C20, driveway and parking lot design. This is just a boilerplate condition that I've used in the past, that, basically requires that the design of driveways and parking areas be reviewed, making sure they're in compliance with the subdivision rules and regs. So. C21, requiring the final architectural drawings to be filed with the building inspector and fire chief. This has to happen under state law. I'm just basically restating the requirement here. C22, project shall conform to all the requirements of DPW for utility connections and payment of all fees. Oops. 150? Is that better?
Yeah, that better?
All right, where were we?
C23.
Field stone for all walls. Any issues with that? Approved plans must show snow storage areas. C25, no construction activities within 100 feet of a wetland resource unless you've got an order of conditions. All right, so that concludes section C. And so now I was going to jump to section H, which deals with some of the MCP requirements. Do you want to?
Is there any questions with regard to section C from the public that they'd like to address at this time? Seeing that there's no questions, we'll move to section 8.
Hi.
Chris.
So if there's wording on the particulate level, maybe I would like to know, how do you know what levels of contaminants are in the dust, and how do you protect for those levels? And certainly if there's no blasting, why strike those paragraphs? Those protections are there for the residents because they're going to be subject to years and years of cumulative damage, and it would just seem like, you know, why strike it if there's not going to be any blasting? We'd rather have, on the odd chance that there is blasting, some protections.
Yeah, my understanding was that language was actually, goes beyond what the state regs require. John seems to think it doesn't, so I'm going to check that to see if it actually provides enhanced protection.
I had spoke to the fire chief this morning, and he had basically said that any contractor who blasting in town, the permit they pull from the fire department would cover everything in this section. But we'll verify with them whether we need to have all 5 subsections or can it be consolidated. And I think with regard, I'll let Paul talk to the dust, even though I think at the next meeting he's going to address it even more detail.
Yeah, we'll address that in more detail, but I know we've used maximum concentrations in the development of action levels in the past when establishing a threshold, site-specific threshold.
Mike?
Mike Judici, Eagle Drive. Just a couple of comments, questions. Regarding the noise and dust, you have you have thresholds there, but there's no follow-up in terms of what happens at that point. What if they're exceeded? Does that mean work stops until the contractor changes his means and methods to get below the thresholds for either noise or dust exceedances? I don't know if that's covered somewhere else, but I would think there should be
Wait till
some.
we get to section H.
Okay, I apologize.
Well, no, I mean, the intent is that there are thresholds, and if there's violations of thresholds, that's a violation of the permit. So there would be a process, just like there would be for any violation of a permit, that there would be an enforcement order, and the applicant would have to come in and explain how they're going to comply.
Okay.
So, I mean, the board would have the discretion, I think, in that circumstance to stop work if that was the appropriate remedy. It may not necessarily be the appropriate remedy.
Okay, that's fine. C12, there was a discussion about sweeping and plowing the interior roads, and again, it may be covered somewhere else, but certainly sweeping of Lawrence Street should be a condition of the permit, because there's going to be some dust, dust transmitted by all the traffic from
I agree. I
construction
thought I
vehicles.
had something like that in here, but if not, I'll look for it.
Okay.
That definitely is going to happen.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then the last one on C25, it says no work within 100 feet of wetlands. Well, they don't have a valid wetland delineation, so how do you know if you're within 100 feet of the wetlands unless they're delineated?
Yeah, that's correct, but it still stands that you can't do work within 100 feet of a wetland, so that's their burden to show that they're complying with that, and if somebody thinks they are, then that's a violation of the permit.
Okay. But wouldn't they have to have a valid delineation on file?
Or
No.
if someone wants to complain about that, there's a process for bringing that to the Conservation Commission.
Did you have a question, Dave?
Yeah, question. For screening that's being proposed along the Lawrence Street properties, I was wondering if we could create a condition for the timing of that screening?
You're saying that basically the fencing, is that what you're referring to when you say the screening?
Whatever was proposed on we've had, I think, pretty limited landscape plans. But I believe the applicant's proposing screening along some of those abutting properties along Lawrence Street. And should there be a condition for when that screening needs to occur, and also whether or not that screening is indeed adequate at the time of installation?
Yeah, there's a landscape section in here. So when we get to that, I think we should make sure. I think my intent was there would be a requirement that all landscaping be completed prior to the issuance of the last occupancy permit or some threshold. That's pretty standard.
I'll double check when we actually
Yeah, and if there's something specific that we should put in for the abutters on Lawrence Street, we can move that up, or, you know.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a good point. All right, so
We got one more for section C?
51 Lawrence Street, I'd like you to keep the clause about vibrations in. My property is quite close to where excavation will happen, so I know that although somebody said within a couple 100 feet, you don't have to worry, but my property is quite close, and for those of us on the north of Lawrence Street, I still don't think that there's enough buffer for us. And how much is the bond for the properties that are, or for the, what is it, the?
Stabilization?
Stabilization, yeah.
We haven't determined that
You
yet.
haven't
Dan's
determined.
working on that.
I'm going to talk to our consulting engineers and get their advice.
Okay.
Question, comment? Vibration is going to last for 7 years, so I think that's something that should be left in pretty firmly. Because even though it might be a specific grade, it's going to accumulate over time.
Okay. We're going to, again,
Sure, I
the
understand.
next meeting.
Just a
our-
comment.
Our consultants are going to address the vibration even in greater depth.
And then
Okay.
the other question that goes along, so you sweep the streets, is there any condition for like houses that get completely dusty? I mean, do they get cleaned on the outside as well periodically? It's a question, something to consider.
Okay. One more comment.
John Godin from 34 Lawrence Street. Can you just scroll down to C8 for me, please, for 1 second?
C8?
C8, yes. I just want to make it clear about parking, that they can't park trucks if it specifically says, it doesn't specifically say, but anything about Lawrence Street. Also, any abutting side roads. Because what happened with some of the earlier work is we had trucks parked right in front of my house on Brett's Farm Road, the corner of Brett's Farm Road and Lawrence, for a long period of time. And I just don't want to see them idling or whatever, you know, if they try to skirt the rule about, I'm not on Lawrence Street, specifically on, you know, that kind of neighborhood, if we can make sure that that's in there as well.
There is a provision that says there won't be any parking or idling of vehicles on any streets outside the developments prior to 7 o'clock. And,
Okay.
and it will be, if there is, it will be enforced and the police will be brought in.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Oh, one more.
So just on that same one, so were we going to have the hours for trucking in a separate paragraph? I thought we were limiting them to certain hours during the day. It was supposed to be like 8:30 to 2:15.
Yeah. Is that not in this draft? Is there not a?
Well, I did see it right there in C8. It just said 7 a.m. to 5.
Is it in there? Yeah. Okay. When we get to the CMP language, we'll make sure it's in there. Okay, so section H?
Yes, section 8.
All right, so basically I drafted a condition that would ensure that the extent of the remaining work to be done on the site to clean it up and to get to a permanent solution is done before any of the site clearing activities would start. And the language I used was based on a conversation that I've had with the town's LSP, Paul, who's here tonight. And Paul explained to me that where we are at this moment in time is that there's been a phase 2 comprehensive site assessment scope of work, that the next step would be data collection, analysis and testing. Then there would be a comprehensive site assessment report prepared by the applicant's LSP, Steve, and that would be circulated for public comment, right, under the PIP process. The anticipated date of delivery for that report is sometime in April or May, and in that document, that report would make some suggestions or recommendations as to the next steps, which, you know, could be additional remediation, response actions, such as removing dirty soil, cleaning up groundwater, and of course, the outcome might be that there's nothing else left to do. We're going to close the site. We're going to create a new activity and use limitation area since the old AUL has been revoked, if that's the right terminology. So the language of this condition is simply saying that we need to get to that point first. We need to have a comprehensive site assessment report. That report needs to be reviewed by our experts before there's any construction activity on the site, since we don't know whether construction activity might actually interfere with latent additional soil or groundwater contamination or the cleanup of that. So that was the purpose of this section, and I also added a paragraph here that, in terms of process, what I'm proposing is that this report be filed simultaneously with our town officials as well as the PIP process. That our consulting engineers, which include a civil engineer, our LSP, and our hydrologist, would have the opportunity to review the report and then comment on what the proposal is for additional work, if any. And Paul explained to me there's different categories of additional work. There's something called a RAM, let's see if I figured it out. No, it's a release abatement measure and a RAP. What's a RAP?
Remedial action plan.
Remedial action plan.
Okay. So those are two potential outcomes where the applicant may have to do some additional remediation. Those plans would be prepared and then circulated for public comment. So the point here is that whatever the next step is for the cleanup of the site, that the town should be reviewing that. I think that was what was going to happen anyway. But as it pertains to the project, I think it's important for our engineers who have been focused and working on the review of this project for the last year and have been making recommendations over the course of the year based upon some assumptions, that they see this report, so that if this report changes any of their prior advice or changes their assumptions that they were working with, that they would provide that input. And that may require changing some of the conditions in the permit. It might require adding new conditions. So I think that's the most prudent course to follow. There would be a peer review period of 30 days. And here's, the paragraph here speaks to any recommendations to changes to the report or a RAM or in the case where the applicant's LSP is suggesting, look guys, we're done, there's no further work to be done, we've achieved a permanent solution, then of course we'd want our experts to review that as well. So then the process would be that the input from our experts would be given to the zoning board. The zoning board would then have a hearing to get that input, that evidence, and then make a decision whether or not it needs to reconsider any of its findings and conditions in this comprehensive permit. So that's section H1 in a nutshell.
Just as a general matter, it goes without saying, it's in the applicant's interest, it's in the neighborhood's interest, and the town's interest to make sure that what work is done, it complies with the MCP and is a permanent solution is achieved. On the other hand, this condition's completely inconsistent with the Holliston HAC case. I mean, the applicant's committed in terms of complying with the laws. And in terms of, I see now that the language is stricken, but having 3 separate peer review engineering consultants review the same project is totally excessive. The applicant can't afford an open checkbook. There's a lot of work to be done here in terms of assessment, and it's going through the PIP process, which is a parallel process. I also believe that it should be the LSP of records decision in terms of what work can proceed, what work cannot proceed in terms of the project, and that's basically that's what the regulations provide. So, so again, I think while it's important, certainly this is a key issue. I think this is a condition that's completely inconsistent with the HAC case law.
Paul, do you want to? Sure. I mean, I think Dan's summary was a good one. You know, in sort of layman's terms, in phase 2, you've got to get your full understanding of site conditions, and at that stage, you know, the applicant's LSP and the applicant will understand what needs to be done, whether they can close the site or maybe there's a risk and more mitigation needs to be done. And under the regulations, you really need to have that understanding before you can proceed to construction. So I think the regulations are pretty clear as to what needs to happen. I think the applicant and the LSP are undergoing testing, and I looked at the scope of work, and I think that it should lead to a much better understanding of the site conditions. And at the end of that process, the review of that report will be out for public comment, and I think at that stage it's fair to look at the conclusions and see if there's a risk and evaluate the process and the way forward.
And I think just to respond to John's comment, I'm aware of the case law, and I've been advising this board consistently that our jurisdiction is limited. There is a state law. The zoning board doesn't have the authority to modify state law or regulate things that are regulated by state law. I think there are some unique factors here. First, Chapter 21E, the Mass Contingency Plan regulations and framework, is very unique in that it's a basically self-regulated process. There is no oversight by any state agencies. This is a process by which a property owner's LSP proposes a remediation and signs off on it and files reports with the DEP, but DEP rarely will actually dig in and audit these projects. And the second factor is that this site actually is a poster child in the sense of the problem with that process, in that there was a cleanup, there was a RAO, there was an AUL, and then there was an audit that revoked it all. So I think that kind of exposes the problem with that process and the weakness of it, and I think that justifies some oversight by the town and in the zoning board where a project is being proposed that affects these issues. So I actually intentionally I attempted to balance the concern John raised about the board overstepping its jurisdiction and getting too far into a state law issue. Honestly, I could have drafted pages of conditions dealing with this issue, but I also think there's a public interest and a Norfolk interest that needs to be being considered. So the language here was my attempt to strike a balance between those two conflicting objectives.
Any questions from the board? I got a question. What exactly does the permanent solution mean? Can anyone answer that?
Permanent solution is essentially closure. And in order to get there, you have to establish what's called a condition of no significant risk. So you collect data and you evaluate the risk, both to receptors, primarily human, ecological, and it's essentially a closure report. And the requirements for that are dictated in the regulations, the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, that are enacted by LSPs, such as myself and the applicant's LSP, Steve. And that's what the permanent solution statement is. It used to be referred to as a response action outcome historically. That was what was previously filed, and under audit it was retracted because there wasn't, some elements of the regulations weren't quite met.
So at the time of permanent solution, is there still the potential that there could be risk to human health?
That's the area where an independent review will help ensure that the risk has been properly characterized. In other words, enough sampling has been done to look at what the contaminants are on the site, how they could affect receptors, both human and the environment, soil, groundwater, indoor air, look at all those variables and determine if those contaminants would pose a risk. And if they do pose a risk, that's where mitigation may be required, either encapsulating the soil by an AUL, that was done previously and may be done as part of the closure as they move forward, or removing the contaminants from the environment. So once that's done and you've established this condition of no significant risk, and that's a prerequisite for closure, and once that can be established and demonstrated, then you can achieve a closure.
There are two types of permanent solutions. The first is the permanent solution with no conditions, and the permanent solution with no conditions means that that you've achieved no significant risk without any contingencies. So essentially, you have a level of contamination on the site that allows for unlimited exposure and unrestricted use. And a permanent solution with conditions is what was previously on this site. It was called a Class A3 RAO at the time. And a permanent solution with conditions means that that condition of no significant risk is contingent upon an activity and use limitation. So in other words, there are levels of contamination that remain on site that if unrestricted use and unlimited exposure were to occur, there could be risk. And so that, therefore, that permanent solution is contingent upon the implementation of that AUL, and of course, maintaining all of the protective measures such as the barrier, soil barrier, to ensure that that condition, no significant risk, exists in perpetuity. So I just wanted to clarify that it's not a one-size-fits-all. There's different levels and different types of permanent solutions, and it's just an important point, especially with this site. With an AUL envisioned, permanent solution with conditions is the likely remedy at the site.
And just to clarify, on this paragraph that I have on the screen, Sean, your edit here was just to basically consolidate the point. I mean, I actually think it's important that our hydrologists review this, and I understand John's comment that there's a limit to how much perhaps we should have experts involved, but I think the hydrology issue is pretty important, and a lot of what Neil Price had advised us was based upon certain assumptions with the contamination. We actually had him look at potential interference and impacts between the contamination and the wastewater treatment plant and in the overall hydrology of the site. So I think it's important that Neil look at it as well as our LSP and our engineer. Sean, do you have any comment on that? Or?
Yeah, just there's a lot of overlap in skill sets. So most of your LSPs are well-versed in groundwater transport, so that's usually their specialty. So just wanted to give the board the opportunity to truncate services if it made sense, or to just consolidate them in one individual.
Just quickly, yeah. I don't think it's really a significant weakness in the regulations. I think the regulations did exactly what they were called to do, because that's why we had the audit process. And likely the project, and when the permanent solution is achieved, there'll be another audit situation. But I think that the significant weakness here was the significant weakness of the firm that did the work initially.
Right, but that firm was supposedly one of the best in the state, and well, and the only reason the audit happened is because somebody asked for it. So I disagree with that.
shout out for the LSPs. All AULs will be audited at some point. That's at Mass DEP's policy. So it was inevitable that the AUL would be audited. And I think I agree with John. I think the process, this site's actually a demonstration that the process does work. So, there are hundreds of sites audited in Massachusetts, and very few of them end up with the audit findings that this site had. So the process does work. The process there is some oversight by Mass DEP. So I just want to make that point as well.
Do you want to keep going?
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask Steve a question? How many AULs do you see on residential sites?
I mean, so Massachusetts is a densely populated, especially eastern Massachusetts, densely populated, and of course now it's more sustainable to build in urban centers. So there's a lot of brownfields work that gets done. And think of the city of Boston, Somerville, Cambridge, all those places where there's old industry and with a very hot housing market. There's a lot of residential properties on formerly industrial and contaminated sites.
Excluding the city of Boston.
Well, you know what? It comes down to economics. So in rural areas, there's enough land, and the land's affordable enough so that what ends up happening is a former industrial site ends up blighted many times, and it's because there's no economic incentive to clean it up, and there's another place to go and build. So certainly less common in rural, but I guess the byproduct of that is then there's a site that goes unaddressed and continues to be a public health hazard.
All right, anything else? All right, section H2, this is basically saying that if there's an imminent hazard condition existing on the project site within that limit of work area, that we have to put a stop on the construction work until we know what's happening and if it's safe to proceed. Now, Paul, I didn't discuss this with you. Do you have any comments on the language here? Is this appropriate, or?
I think it's
All right. This is now a H3. The applicant shall be obligated to achieve a permanent solution. Goes without saying the applicant's going to do that, but I think it's important to stick that in here as an affirmative requirement. Okay, so that's what I have so far for section H. Obviously, we can continue to get input from Paul and from Sean and Bill if they have anything else to add. Do you guys do you have any questions, or?
I think we have some public questions.
Go ahead. I have another question on, so H3. My big question is, when are they required to achieve, or when are they obligated to get that final solution? In other words, does that permanent solution have to occur before the first person or family moves in?
So I purposely did not address that explicitly, and I did that intentionally because I don't know if that's really necessary, and I think that'll be part of the review of the comprehensive site assessment report. So our LSP can tell us, okay, so there's some additional work to be done. That work is on the other side of the tail race. That's not going to affect residents, and if that's appropriate, then it might be appropriate to allow the construction to go forward and to actually have potentially houses sold while there might be some additional work happening on another part of the site. But I purposely didn't address that here because I think that's better addressed through the review of that comprehensive site assessment report. Okay. But that's just my approach.
Well, yeah, no, that's right. You can achieve they can do the construction and people can be on the site before closure. However, the risk, again, is the key. So to establish there's no risk, we don't want residents living on this parcel when there is risk. So that would be on the applicant to demonstrate through these MCP submittals that there's no risk and it's appropriate for residential use at that time. But they certainly can be residential use before closure.
But at the time of occupancy, there would you say that there would not be risk to human health at that time?
That's what needs to be established, so through
But
the sampling and through the.
That would be established before the first?
Yes.
Okay.
And Paul, you actually, I think, explained to me that with these RAM plans, it's actually fairly common for remediation to be happening at the same time as new construction.
Yep, absolutely. This RAM, or release abatement measure, is the most common vehicle that construction happens under the MCP, and it has obligations to understand the site, look at the risk, make sure you're not exacerbating conditions during construction, such as creating dusty conditions with contaminated soil into the nearby residents. Those are sort of best management practices that should be detailed in a RAM, but it also facilitates the construction and the rehabilitation of a site and allows it to move forward, provided the risk is managed. That's the keep coming back to that, but that's the key.
Okay.
Someone's been raising their hand. Yeah, no, we're gonna get to that.
All right. Allow the public to comment.
Good evening. We now have another LSP, just to let you know. I've been retained by Mr. Diamond to represent the PIP group. I have looked at the Phase 2 scope of work. I'll be looking at the results that comes out of it. I look forward to working with you.
Can you just introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Jeffrey Nangle. And I have to say that your H1 is spot on, because the biggest concern that I have is when you have a condition, and you have not achieved a condition of no significant risk, it's awful hard to approve something to let the public with unrestricted access to get onto there. It's a really tough thing to sort out. They probably will get a permanent solution with conditions before it becomes an issue, but I think the language is very good in speaking to that. As far as the hydrology goes, that's probably the biggest concern. You're taking out 650,000 yards of gravel. You're going to change the recharge characteristics. You're going to change the runoff characteristics. You're going to change the hydrology across the disposal site. Fate and transport will be affected. You have a discharge condition out of the bedrock, and so I think having a good hydrology evaluation, a reevaluation, is critical. Thank you.
Any other comments?
Assuming we get back to an AUL, which I assume it will be cleaned up, there will be an AUL. Who will own that AUL at the end when it's cleaned up and people are moving in?
Plan is that would be included within the open space area, to the extent that there are any precautions that are required to be maintained in terms of maintaining a condition of no significant risk. Those will be followed and complied with. Typically, this would be the homeowners association that might have responsibility for that open space area.
Yeah, we've been speaking about the open space area would be retained in fee by the homeowner association, not the town of Norfolk, and that a conservation restriction would be placed on that acreage through which presumably the Conservation Commission of the town of Norfolk would hold a conservation restriction to enforce it, but that the fee would be retained by the applicant's successor in title. All right, anything else?
I got another question. If it hasn't been determined what the extents of the contaminations are, if, say, there was contamination under a public road, is there a mechanism that, I'm not sure the town would want to accept a road as public if there's contaminated soil underneath it.
The phase 2 that they're preparing right now, collecting data for, one of the primary objectives is to delineate the full extent of the contamination horizontally, vertically, and in different media: soil, groundwater, soil vapor, surface water, sediment. So that's almost the number one objective of the phase 2 is to delineate and characterize where the contaminants are. So they can't submit or meet the performance standards for a phase 2 unless they've defined the limits of contamination. And then if it went into a roadway or, then that's a, different story if it's off-site boundaries, but that unknown should be resolved with the submittal of the phase 2 as to the boundaries of the
When is
contamination.
phase 2 gonna be?
It's May, right? May timeframe is when they're anticipate getting all of their data and preparing the report and submitting it. And the regulations, I mean, literally a line on a map, here's the extent of the contamination, so.
So there will not be any roads in place at that point.
Okay. So the town could say at that point, the town doesn't want to accept these roads if there was
Well,
contamination.
if there is contaminants, obviously they're gonna have to be dealt with. They wouldn't be left under a roadway. They would be dealt with then at that point.
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of questions would come up with that. Is the contamination a result of the existing site? Is it a result of some other source? All those questions come into play. So if there is contamination identified, whether it's addressed under that case ID, the release tracking number that exists for, Buckley and Mann, or is it a new release tracking number? But if you have contaminants, typically you would report it to Massachusetts DEP, and then whoever is responsible for that contamination is off and running to address it.
And Rich, do we accept, when we accept new roads, are we taking the fee of these roads or an easement? Do you know? We do take the fee?
So on H2, I'm a little confused. So are you saying there's no construction activities until you get a permanent solution? So if you, at the time, an imminent hazard, if at any time an imminent hazard condition exists on the project site within the limit of work area, all construction activities must cease. But we're already going to have a permanent solution, or no?
No. The condition as drafted does not require a permanent solution prior to the commencement of activities.
Okay, so what limits the commencement of activities?
Phase 2 site assessment report, and it's reviewed by our experts. They're going to tell us whether there's any issues, and if construction needs to stop, ending something, or that's going to be the process. We have to see what the report says first, and then decide what comes next. But that's the draft. The board can change the condition, they can receive input, and if people think that we should wait until a permanent solution, and the board can consider that as well. All right. So that wraps up section H for now, and then we can jump back to section A, start from the top. I don't know if you want to, if you guys want to stick around, you can, but I don't think we.
We'll plan on seeing you. We're gonna, for the Yellow Streets, this hearing will be continued next week, which will be, I think it's February 6th, next Wednesday. So I don't know if that's enough time for you two to work through the noise, vibration, and dust, and have recommendations for us, but we will be meeting then. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, wait, do you want to go? All right. So we're going to start at the top. And by the way, there are in the draft document several pages of findings, probably 9 pages of findings that the applicant has proposed. I haven't reviewed those yet, and so that'll come later. The way I like to draft these decisions, I like to start with the conditions. I feel like once we get a set of conditions drafted, then it's appropriate to kind of back into those conditions with findings. So starting with section A, this is the general sort of overall conditions for the project. Before any site clearing activities or construction, the applicant has to submit a revised set of plans. And so this is kind of a standard way of handling these kind of projects. We've got a set of plans. We've got revisions as of tonight. The project has to be built in compliance and conformity with those plans that have been submitted to us as amended by the conditions of our decision. And so that's going to require the applicant to then go back and come up with another set of plans that comply with our decision. So that revised set of plans would then get submitted to the zoning board for review by our technical consultants. And then if our consultants say, this looks great, everything it complies with the decision, then the board approves them, signs them, stamps them, they get recorded at the registry of deeds, and they can proceed with their their project. And now that is called, in this decision, the approved plans. Most of Section A is boilerplate. I can stop if anyone has specific comments with sections. There's notice requirements, fee requirements. And by the way, there'll be two decisions since there are two projects. So most of the most of the decision is going to be repeated for the other project. There'll be some unique conditions.
Just as a general observation, if you know, we're working towards you know, in terms of submitting plans and so on, that I think that it's important that upon submittal of a complete set of materials, that they be reviewed within a certain time frame, so that we don't have you know, 60, 90, 120 days go by before materials are reviewed. And so we suggest that when we're dealing with anything that is submitted to be reviewed, that it be reviewed within a certain time frame, stated time frame, upon receipt of complete information.
Yep. That's reasonable. That's fine. Okay. So I'm just kind of racing through these. If anyone wants to talk about them, just stop me. So Section B is the next section, and this is, again, a standard condition. Before the applicant begins any construction activities, the applicant shall have done A through G, or whatever it is. So the first one is get the board's approval of the approved plans, what we just talked about. So actually, John, I think I actually put in a 30-day requirement right here in Section A. Yeah, B1B obtained approval of the applicant's construction management plan. So this acknowledges that there's been a preliminary plan that's been circulated and commented on. And this just itemizes the contents of the plan. And if we're going to put specific times of truck traffic, we should probably work that into this section. So I can, I think Sean was the primary reviewer of the plan, so I can work with him to make sure what we agreed to with the applicant during the hearing gets incorporated as conditions here. Any comments on this section? Is there anything from? The applicant has to get any approvals from the Board of Health or DEP. He needs to get a water connection permit and street opening permit. We should just confirm with Bob McGee that I've covered all the permits that are required here locally. Okay. All right. He has to get subsidy approval from Mass Housing. They have to get their the NIPD's permit. You already did the EIR, right? ENF, right, sorry. Discharge permit, you've started that process, you've done your hydro study, so then there'll be an additional submittal to DEP after this permit's issued to get your actual permit. The applicant must deposit money into the town's escrow account to pay for the consultant review of the project. That needs to be replenished.
Just quickly on that point, rather than submitting a blanket amount as a deposit, can we simply have a mechanism to be able to have a chance to review the scope, and then once an amount is identified, then the applicant will submit the dollar amount required to complete the task, rather than just a blanket arbitrary amount of $20,000. Just, you know, just basically that before you proceed, that funds, a certain amount of funds are set aside to ensure payment of the next task. Again, instead of just putting out a blanket amount there.
Take that under advisement. So that's B. That was easy. We already did C.
Any comments on B from the public before we move on?
I think the ENF did require a draft EIR, and
Sandra, can you talk up?
the ENF required a draft EIR, environmental impact report. So are we going to get one before this proceeds?
Can you address that?
The issuance of a final certificate on the EIR is a precondition to the issuance of state permits. So, once that process is completed, then, certainly that information will be provided.
So do you have a time frame on that?
I don't think we do at this point.
So Sandy, you asked when are we going to see it? We are going to see it, right? Because that's what this requires. So.
I would say at the minimum, a draft EIR will probably be submitted when we actually get the results back from the studies of scope of work and PIP, because that was such an important part of what the comments were in the ENF. It only makes sense to get those results back and incorporate that into a draft EIR.
All right, anything else? All right, D is another mostly boilerplate section. D1, any transfer of the property requires zoning board approval. Subsequent owners are bound by the terms of the comprehensive permit. There's going to be affordable housing documents that need to be reviewed along the way. D4, common area landscaping needs to be maintained. D5 gives the zoning board explicit right to reopen the hearing if there's been a breach of the conditions. D6 states the intent of the applicant to present the main roads as public ways, present them to the town for acceptance. And actually, this is probably where that condition you talked about, Rich, should go, about the top coat being through a final winter season. Anything else on D?
Any questions on D?
Section E deals with traffic, public safety, and fire protection. E1, school bus, appropriate school bus stops within the site. E2, traffic signage. E3, just standard boilerplate, providing for safe travel throughout the site. So I wanted to have some definition here under E3 as to where we measure these setbacks and driveway lengths. And Sean, you marked this up. Do you want to explain?
It's pretty much as Rick described. What we wanted to do is clarify that the driveway had to have a minimum depth as measured from either the edge of traveled way or from the edge of a public sidewalk. So that's what that language does, and it's consistent with Rick's detail, which his typical roadway section on his plans, which does a nice job of defining it as well.
I guess my only concern that was when we looked at one of the plans, I think that Matt had put up at the last hearing or the hearing before, the condo driveway kind of blended in with the individual driveways. And it wasn't really obvious to me where the line was, where the, you know, I mean, where the line between the street was with the individual driveways. Am I being too nitpicky about that point? It just, I mean, I suppose you could paint a white line and.
Yeah, what you traditionally do there is so in Rick's typical roadway detail, everything's defined off a center line. So the roadway is 12 feet to either side of the center line, so that pretty much defines the edge of road, whether it kind of looks visually like it kind of meanders all over the place. It'll be pretty well defined from the center line of the road.
Okay, I guess that's a good point. So you can always measure from the center line.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, E6, this is the requirement the applicant's going to widen Lawrence Street to 24 feet. And then we've got the sidewalk language here, which I highlighted this in yellow because I want to make sure we run this by DPW. Did you have any comments, applicant, on this?
Just one comment in terms of the timing. I'm not sure. I mean, that's a lot of expense to incur right up front in terms of prior to the first CO. What I would suggest is maybe that the timing and the phasing is included within the construction management plan as part of the phasing, so that we have a further discussion about that.
I mean, it seems like something that would be in the decision, not the construction management plan. That's not really a.
Well, maybe
but,
maybe want to table it and have that discussion.
Okay. Was I correct that this is a 4-foot wide sidewalk? I heard you say 5 foot before. Okay.
On E6, I should just touch base with Bob as far as, I know it says reconditioning, but we probably want to have a better idea what that means.
So Sean actually recommended we take that language out and just say widening.
I don't think we're actually wide now. I think we're already at 24, aren't we?
What is it currently?
Well, it varies. It's 24, 26. I think the.
I think it varies 24 to 22, I think, when we measured it. Was it 26? Okay. So you want to bring it to 24, keep it at 26, Rich?
I have it, well, I mean, I prefer narrow roads, but, I mean. You have to drive slower.
Yeah, we're talking about Lawrence Street.
We're
talking about
Lawrence Street, right? Yeah, yeah. I seen you on Park Street the other day.
So maybe widening is the wrong word? What should we use? Gentle?
We have to discuss the timing of the sidewalk.
Yep. Okay, moving on, E7, numbering and ID approved by the fire and police chief. E8,
Sorry,
Okay.
we actually do the addressing, land use department.
oh, okay, sure. So, do I take the assessing out? Do they still get involved, or?
Put in the office.
No. Got it. Okay. E8. Okay, E9, limiting the size of the vehicles parking on the project site.
Where did that one come
I really don't understand that condition.
Well, it's.
I mean, you're going to have non-construction vehicles? Or, I mean, are there vehicles that are in excess of 18 feet?
Mobile
What if you have a
homes.
vehicle with a boat?
Your Airstream trailer, John?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So you're not going to allow trailers to come through the property?
Not come through, it's parking in the driveways.
Yeah. Should that be left to?
Right. Yeah, your driveways are, what, 20 feet max, so. Do you want to think about it? We'll table it.
Maybe the wording of it a little bit. Yeah, I think the wording of it. I think your point is, John, is that during construction, this would say you couldn't have a trailer in this condition, which would be larger than 18 feet. I don't think that's the intent of it. Your intent is post-construction, correct?
But why don't we stay in driveways? Because that's the concern, is that.
What we should do is, should we not allow it to overhang the sidewalk or the public way?
I don't think you should restrict to the size of the vehicle, but no car is a vehicle, so you have a car extending across a public way or sidewalk.
Whether it's 6 feet or 20 feet.
I mean, in urban construction, you wouldn't have even defined driveways.
Right.
Yeah, it's close.
Okay, E10. So, yeah, E10 kind of goes to, I guess, Rick's work. You guys are going to get us a revised waiver list. I haven't looked at what you sent recently, but have you laid out requests for waivers from the road design standards? Okay. Do you want to speak to those? Okay.
They want to hear you. They want to hear what you said.
Can't hear you, Tom.
Sorry.
I think it's pretty lengthy, and probably the consultant might want to take a chance to look at it there. When you break down the subdivision regulations, the 5.0, and I think it's 4.14, it's multiple pages that you have to go through when you don't do a blanket waiver.
Okay, so, Bill, can you look at that for the next meeting? And.
Yeah, I just need to get a copy.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, so you don't have the updated waiver yet? Okay. Make sure Bill gets the updated waivers. John, I think did you send them to Bill? I think you, yeah.
No, I sent it.
Okay, so we need to, discuss that at the next meeting, the road design standards and the waivers that are needed. No building permit until the basin binder code is installed. Water lines need to be installed prior to issuance of building permits. Oops. Compliance with the NFPA standards that are part of the state fire prevention code.
Just want to speak to that. NFPA 241 was adopted under the state fire code. Fire chief hasn't asked for this in terms of what I understand.
Okay,
That's a
we'll
$10,000 item it's usually an NFPA 241 report is usually put together for a larger building, a skyscraper, assisted living facility, things of that nature. Not typically done for a single-family residential house or a duplex. So.
Yep. I'm not sure how to handle this, the dam issue. This is on the project site, but it's not really part of the project.
It's on the project site, but I guess my thought is that if work is required with respect to the dam, it would need to obtain a dam permit from the DCR's Division of Dam Safety. So it's subject to any state permit.
All right, I guess I would defer to our consultants if we need a condition in here. I don't know if.
There's a registration requirement and there's an inspection requirement, so maybe we just reiterate that in the terms.
Under state law?
Yeah.
All right. There was some traffic mitigation proposed, and I don't have a note as to where we landed on that. Your traffic engineer had come up with these. Actually, no, this was from Beta. So I don't know. I don't remember if we even discussed whether that was going to be part of a condition on the permit or that was just merely suggestions that were being floated by Beta.
No, we discussed a lot about Park Street and Main Street. Some road calming.
Well, that's what this is. This was Jason's suggestions.
And Rich, you had mentioned something about the shoulder on Main Street. Yeah. You want to?
So a couple things that DPW has been doing along the shoulder within the right-of-way, if be the case, is removing some of the grade to lower it to create a better line of sight as you're heading on Main Street and you come up to Park Street and the intersection of Main on the right-hand side. If that grade could be, if there's room within the layout to lower a little bit, so that way when you come up towards the center of town going Park Street, you could then see cars coming from Franklin better because, as you come up, I'm sure people, it gets tricky. You end up as far as line of sight. So if we could have, I don't know if we could do it or not, but at least see, because I know there's vegetation discussion about removing that, but if we could also do some grading, that's what DPW is going to be out, doing on Rockwood Road, similar thing that they're.
Bill, do you think we should have Jason review this? Did he have a chance to review this with you and give us some bullet points of what he thinks has to be done?
Yeah, you and I talked today about this. So in Green International's letter dated August 30th of 18 and our letter dated August 31st, there's a list of mitigation measures that I think we're all need to in terms of the sign, some pavement markings. We did have concerns of recommendation. I think what's in here is a little bit dated about restriping Park Street for 2 lanes at the intersection. We had some concerns with that. Probably because the stripe goes across a state-owned bridge. So you have to get massive DOT approval. You'll also be taking out shoulders that exist there that bicyclists and pedestrians use since there's no sidewalks. So I think there's certain mitigation measures that I think everyone's agreed to. I think Park Street probably needs more looking at, more discussion with DPW. There's also site monitoring suggestions. I think we all need to, one of them was at Main and Park Street, there were others at the site entrances.
Okay, so I basically have the wrong list. I need to go back to the August 31st letter and, okay.
There was some concern about bringing 2 lanes of traffic to Main Street. There's 2 lanes out of the Main Street. You're affecting line of sight just by doing that.
I think our recommendation now is not to move forward with that. Look at other options.
All right. So that's section E.
Yeah, like, we take one more suggestion, roads that would be accepted by the town, potentially accepted by the town. Any of the pedestrian facilities, sidewalks, curb ramps should be designed and built to ADA standards, Massachusetts ADA standards. The town's going to accept them.
Okay.
Any questions with section E?
Sorry, I'm not sure where this really fits in, and you can tell me to stop and we can revisit it later. But we're really facing delays with the construction of the bridge, and it's really become an inconvenience to those of us who live up Lawrence Street, because there's only one way of egress in back. I mean, we can't even get into the town. We've got to go through Franklin and go all the way around. So is there something that we can put in the conditions as far as the putting in the water main and all of that construction, that we can minimize the timeline that happens in? I don't know if that's something that we can do, but in terms of the school bus, it's taking longer for our kids to get to school. It's just adding time to our day every day. And if this is going to keep going on for a long time, I just want to make sure that we're not allowing the roadway to be under construction for 7 years itself. Something, I don't know if that's something that can be done, but just a consideration.
We could add a condition that any street closures shall be limited to that which is necessary and for the construction of the utilities, or something to that effect. And I think your point is you don't want any unnecessary closures, right? So.
Just a couple questions on Lawrence Street. I forget what paragraph it was. But there's no definition in terms of what the actual roadway treatment is going to be. They talked about potentially widening it, and then it sounded like maybe we don't have to widen it. But after the water main goes in, typically you want the trench to sit over winter season so that the trench can settle. But then what is the treatment after that? Is it just overlay? Is it going to be reclaimed? Is it going to be reconstructed? That's not defined in there, and there are 3 very different treatments. I would presume we'd leave that up to the discretion of the DPW to dictate what gets done.
That was the point I was trying to make earlier about that we need clarification from DPW director as far as what's going to happen to the Lawrence Street as part of it. Whether it's,
I think he's got some areas identified that can be reclaimed, other areas, some areas that he wants to reclaim, other areas he's looking at overlay.
Yeah.
So I think that they're laying that out now.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
And just a couple other, regarding the sidewalk that was discussed earlier, it doesn't look like, I don't believe they did a right-of-way survey. So although, from the appearance, I assume those property lines are from the assessor's plans, as we all know aren't very accurate. So the paved road might not actually be as close to that northern right-of-way line as they showed on that plan. If you do a right-of-way survey, you'll find out exactly where the paved road is within the right-of-way, and there may actually be room on the north side to put the sidewalk, and you don't need an easement, just a suggestion.
Aren't they doing a right-of-way survey for Lawrence Street?
The locations of the pavement improvements and right-of-way were from a field survey along Lawrence Street in that area.
Okay, that's fine. It didn't appear that way. I don't know if they found monumentation and to the actual layout. Okay, understood. And then in terms of the trucking that we all know and we've been talking about for quite some time, as you know, the causeway and bridge are being reconstructed by the town at a cost of about $2 million. Sure. Just talking about the causeway reconstruction that's happening now, that the town is undergoing. So all the trucking from the gravel removal that's going to happen over the course of 8 years is going to, do a lot of damage to that very new roadway. So I would suggest that maybe there's some sort of a bond that's included as a condition, so that at the end of the 8 years, if that newly paved causeway is showing, distress in terms of, the condition after all that trucking, it's going to probably be equivalent to, a 20 or 30 year performance period just based on the amount of trucks. So you might want to consider a bond to repair that road after the trucking potentially. Just a consideration. And then lastly, as a minor point, I think it was paragraph E7, talked about the naming of the streets. And it talked about the police and fire chief. I believe that's under the jurisdiction of the Board of Selectmen, but I'm not 100% certain. Rich might know that.
So that's correct. The naming does fall on the Board of Selectmen. They just consult with the police and fire to make sure there's, issues with similar names, but that's all right.
Yeah, and typically, I mean, the zoning board steps into the shoes of a lot of these local boards, and I think that would be something that I don't think the selectmen probably care about being involved with, but maybe they do, I don't know. But we'll check, right? Okay. All right, anything else? Oh.
Can you explain the intent? Can you explain the intent of E9? E9. That's about the truck, the 18-foot truck. Is that?
So the intent of the condition is so that we don't have extra long vehicles parked in driveways that overhang into the sidewalk or encroach into the street.
Is that during construction?
No.
After occupancy?
It's post.
Okay.
I'm going to reword this.
Yeah, because I mean, honestly, I just think what you're trying to get to is that people can't just bring their oversized work vehicles. Essentially, is that?
No, this is after the project's
post-construction.
Right, I'm saying, so if I'm a resident, I can't bring my oversized work vehicle and park it in my driveway and have it overhang. Is that the understanding
Yes.
I'm getting? Okay, all right, just checking. And then the other thing also is, in terms of the sidewalks, it really is a necessity that they be put in prior. It's going to be construction and driving and safety that's going to be an undue burden on the street. And there are children, there's school buses. It really should be put in prior to construction starting, and it should be on one side of the street. This is a safety issue. It's a huge safety issue. I'm sure you don't disagree with me, but I just think it's something that we should say as residents.
Thank you.
We're still on these, but Karen, 26 Lawrence Street. Just a question again on the roadways. Is there any additional drainage or pitching being added? Because right now, we had recently, within the last probably 6 years, we had some of it newly paved, and now where there wasn't flooding, there's tons of flooding, to the point that the other day, kids couldn't get off school buses, one of them being my house, because you would have needed a canoe to get them off the school bus. We had to walk up the street to get them off a school bus. So if there's any extra drainage or proper pitching, would be appreciated, but extra drainage would, I think, be appreciated.
Rich, can you talk to Bob McGee about that? Okay. Keep going?
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, landscaping. So the concept here is that a final landscape plan would be submitted prior to the issuance of a building permit. It looks like you guys are pretty far along on that anyway, so that landscape plan would be peer reviewed by the zoning board, and this condition just has some language as to what would be required for that plan.
I think it's standard for 1 year as opposed to a 2-year growing season.
What was that, John?
He wants this to be 1 year?
I think it's standard for 1 year as opposed to a 2-year growing season.
Who's standard?
Your decision except for yours.
The small X standard?
John, you know all about trees. 2 years always. I think the zoning board actually in the past has used 2 years. on other projects.
Is that just for the common areas and the public right-of-ways?
That was the intent, yeah.
Okay, if we could just be specific with that.
Sure.
Is this the section we talked about, the screening?
Yeah.
So Dan,
Cover it
so
actually
could
now.
you add,
Oh, we're not done, you have to sit
could you
down.
add the slopes that have been vegetated to that 2 years?
The slopes that are on the lots abutting 51, is that?
Right, well, any that are, 3-to-1, 2-to-1 slopes need vegetation and maintain the vegetation.
I couldn't hear.
Maintain the
You have to speak up.
vegetation.
What's the question?
Maintain the vegetation also on the slopes that are actually on private property, but need to be maintained for erosion control.
Yeah, I guess I don't really consider that landscaping, but I suppose.
That would be part of any site stabilization that we would have to do anyway, so we've got to get those slopes to take as far as the seed goes, so that the contractor will be responsible for making sure that happens.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a stabilization issue more than landscaping.
Sean, is that outlined in the construction management plan as well?
And it's also in their NIPD's permit as well.
Okay, so I want to make sure we address the screening component. So I don't think we have any specific language to screening around those southern lots. Do we want to build something in there that, did we talk about an affirmative requirement of screening on those lots? Did we talk about imposing like an affirmative requirement of a row of trees or any kind of screening around like 51 Lawrence Street or the other properties on Morris?
What I was maybe gonna suggest is if we had a condition that more or less screening, if it's deemed that the screening is not enough, then determine that it's not enough, after a field inspection, additional screening would be required.
Field inspection by who?
And what's not enough? I mean, I get the point, because there's a landscape plan that is conceptual and not.
Bill?
Yeah, I think in the original plan, when the grading was only much closer to the property line, 51 Lawrence, we talked about screening. I think with the new plan, we haven't looked at it, the grading is pulled back from the property line, so there's no natural vegetation remaining. Right? And maybe the condition of, I'm not sure how you do it, but making sure post-construction that visual screening exists. Right? I think the natural vegetation that's remaining now, probably provide screening to try to replicate it one time.
Rich, I think you had said that the house at 51 Lawrence Street sits about 13 feet above the new development houses, correct? And that there is not going to be a grading change on the left corner of 51, or it's going to be very gradual going down to the existing, correct? Yeah. Want to table that and think about that a little bit as to how we?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be addressed through the review of the landscape plan.
Yeah.
To me, I think it's important to have, if it's deemed that if the existing vegetation is to remain and it's not enough, and you can just clear line of sight into the site, then additional screening would be required. It maybe, I don't want to throw Rich under the bus, maybe the town planner could be the person who makes that determination.
I think I'd rather review the landscape plan. Let's look at the landscape plan. Yeah. Yeah, let's look at the landscape plan.
Looking onto the condition that says that there will be a screening that
what do you show now in that area for landscaping?
We haven't redone the landscape plan since the site layout has changed, so we've got that illustrative plan that we showed earlier where we're showing a deeper natural vegetated buffer there because the grading is pulled back. So we haven't shown much more detail other than that at this point.
So we're going to see more detail.
You are going to see more detail, that's correct. Yep.
Specifically, we're talking about 51 Lawrence.
That's right.
So upon approval of the
Yeah.
landscaping plan.
Should we put a condition in here that just requires there to be landscaping in terms of screen from the Lawrence Street neighbors to the project site? And then at least lay that out there as a requirement, and then the review of the actual details would come when we look at the plan.
Tom? Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay. Okay. So any other comments on landscaping? Moving on to section G.
Dan, sorry. I had one more point on that is, when should the screening happen? Specifically the ones along just the existing abutters. So when should the screening take place for along those?
Yeah, so I mean, I've seen it both ways. I mean, I think you're probably coming from the concern that that should probably go in at the beginning so that the construction is not impacting those neighbors as much, right? So the screen would serve as a buffer even during construction. I mean, typically landscaping is put in, after construction, when you have a better idea of what you want to put in, but it might make sense to put screening in before for those specific abutters. But of course you don't want the trees to get in the way of any work you're doing in those lots, so.
After grading and stabilizing.
Yeah.
And there was going to be, was it a 25-foot buffer plus the vegetated buffer, correct? On the backside of those, correct? There's going to be a, wake up. There's going to be a 25-foot buffer on the backside of 51 plus the vegetated buffer, correct?
The buffer is 25 feet.
in total.
Total.
Okay. And that's going to be, and behind the sign, behind 51 is going to be pretty much existing.
Minimum of 25 feet,
Untouched buffer.
and it will be untouched vegetation.
Okay, so what's there now? Okay. I think we're going to, it's 10 of 10, 5 of 10, so I think we're going to stop it right here.
Okay.
Okay, for tonight. I couldn't hear anything you just said, so could you come up?
Sorry. We didn't get a chance to comment on any of the beginning presentation before we started going through the conditions. Were we able to comment on those tonight? Because you said at the last meeting that we would be able to comment more this meeting, and we're still not getting much commenting, so.
What were you specifically referring to?
Well, all the stuff that was shown at the beginning, where like the signage and all those other things, there was talk about the sidewalks, and we just didn't get a full chance to comment on all of that.
Would it be possible if we took care of that at the beginning of the next meeting? If you have questions, to put them in writing and pass them on to Amy so that we can answer them at the beginning of the next meeting?
Sure.
It's actually for the benefit of the employees of the school system here. Would that be possible? All right, great, thank you.
I don't think this is going to happen, but is there a way we also can put in this that if, God forbid, Mr. De Placido go bankrupt, that the development can't be any larger than what we've agreed on. Is there something that could be put in there? Is that fair?
It's already in there.
It is,
The
all right.
project is capped at the density of 176 units, and it has to be built in accordance with the plans that we approved.
Okay, I appreciate that, thank you.
All right, this time,
Chris, can I ask one more question? On, I believe it was 14 Lawrence Street, there was talk about relocating the driveway. As it exists, it goes to Lawrence Street. And I can't remember what it was, when that meeting was, but there was talk about moving it to, I believe, Cranberry Meadow Road. And I wasn't sure where that stands and if that should be addressed in a condition as well.
Yeah. Is that still happening?
That's all I got.
at this time, could I get a motion?
Sorry, I was the resident at 14 Lawrence Street, and yeah, we're still interested in doing that. I think I wanted to meet back up again with Tom just to talk about the layout of it a little bit, just with turnaround spots and stuff like that. So minor modifications to it. So.
Can I get your name?
Mark Pauley, 14 Lawrence Street.
What's the last name?
Pauley, P-A-U-L-Y.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Any concerns? I have a motion to continue the public hearing for Abbeville until February 6th.
I just want to ask if I can just bring publicly that I'd like my driveway moved too. I would like to see if I could have my driveway moved too. That was one thing I've written you a letter, and I'd love to see if that could be possible. So, just to reiterate, thank you.
Okay. Could we get a motion to continue the public hearing till February 6th at 7:15 p.m.? It is going to be at Town Hall, room 124.
So moved.
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I have a motion to close the public hearing for the ZBA for this evening at 9:55 p.m.?
So moved.
Second? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.